As cities began to grow in America, we had some major problems, okay? This is still the 1800s. We're getting close to the 1900s. But a modern society like we have, where most things are clean and orderly, that is not what was happening. People were throwing up these horrible little shack-like buildings and living in them with no electricity, no plumbing. You know, that was average life in America. So, urban problems, rapid urbanization's impact, okay? And again, urbanization means the growth of cities, okay? Urban means cities. All right, so housing shortages. Tried to solve the problem with dumbbell tenements, but they created a rat-infested nightmare. Okay, a tenement is an apartment building, basically, okay? So, nowadays we have air conditioning, we have access to windows and things like that. But in the old days, when they were just throwing up these cheap buildings real quick in New York City, they actually had a big old solid building with no airflow in the middle. So if you had an inner apartment, good luck. You have no window. You literally have no air conditioning, no window, no sewage disposal, nothing like that. People used to basically do their business in a bucket, okay? And they would throw it out in the morning. Now, if you had an outside apartment, you could chuck it out the window and it would splash on the people below. So you can imagine trying to make your way to work at 5 in the morning and you're dodging what they called night soil. Basically was buckets of crap and pee that was thrown from stories above your head and landing all over you. Sometimes it would run knee deep, okay, in the streets. Well, they solved this problem, or at least they thought they did, by creating a particular style of apartment called the dumbbell tenement. Now, if you look at them, okay, it's two buildings basically put together with a central air shaft, okay? Now, this came about because there became a law in New York City that every apartment, if you were gonna charge rent, had to have a window. You have to have some kind of way to dispose of garbage and to get fresh air, because people were getting really sick inside of these breeding grounds for disease, okay? There was a lot of disease at the time. Well, if you look at it, remember what I said, what did people do with their night soil? They chucked it out the window, right? Garbage too, everything. Look at the design of this building. They have basically created a gigantic trash can, okay? If you lived in one of the inner apartments, you would throw your garbage and your human waste, your food waste, all that into the middle. And there was no way to get it out. Okay, there's no access to it at the bottom. There's no big hole for it all to flow out, you know, a big archway or something. There was no garbage pickup at this time either. The only thing that would clean the cities out is when it would rain and everything would flow towards the river, okay? So garbage collection starts around the turn of the century. Basically, you have garbage trucks and you have these big old piles of garbage that they would shovel into it, and they would go dump it right into the Hudson Bay in New York City. But getting back to dumbbell tenements, okay? Now, if you lived on the first floor, on the inside, you got the cheapest apartment because that's the worst place in New York to live. Imagine as the garbage started piling up in this central shaft, okay? Sometimes it'll be 3 or 4 stories deep. And the people on the first row and the second row and the third row, as the garbage collected, they would have to board their windows shut so that way an avalanche of all this garbage would not flow through their house whenever the windows broke from the pressure. Oftentimes when you had a baby, you would try to make sure that that baby slept with the parents because there was a bad thing happening. If you put 30 feet of garbage in the middle of a building and let it sit there for years, what is that going to attract? You're going to have flies, you're going to have roaches, you're going to have maggots, you're going to have rats. Rats were the big problem, okay? If you heard the baby crying at night, you better go check, because a lot of the times the rats were crawling in through your apartment and having a little snack, which was your baby's fingers or toes. So a lot of these people grew up maimed from living in these conditions. Now, every once in a while, to have fun, the people that lived in the apartment buildings, these dumbbell tenements, would have a rat hunt. Okay, they would do this every Sunday, and they would use little 22 rifles or shotguns, pellet guns, stuff like that, and they would see how many they could kill. Now there was competitions: who could get the most rats, who could get the biggest rats, and the winner gets the prize. Now let me tell you, the whole neighborhood got a prize at the end, because guess what they did with the rats whenever everybody was finished with this big rat hunt? They would skin them and they would cook them up like squirrels, okay? And they would eat them up top on the rooftop. They would have a neighborhood party every Saturday or Sunday where they ate the rats, okay? First full-time police force in America ever is New York City in the 1860s. Early immigrants simply banded together to protect themselves from gangs of nativists. Now remember, we got nativists that are born here. They don't like the new immigrants because they're stealing their jobs or forcing wages down. So to protect themselves, they lived in their little neighborhoods, Little Italy, okay, Chinatown, those things, the 5 Points district that we talked about. This right here is Little Italy, okay? Without a police force, basically, the immigrants were left to fend for themselves, and this is where the first gangs of America started. First gangs of America were not the Bloods and the Crips, okay? They were the Irish 5 Points gangs and the Italian mafia and this kind of stuff. And without a police force, if somebody in the area got murdered, your gang would get together, figure out who did it, and they would lynch them. Okay, that was basically how it worked. Now, with all these horrible conditions that are going on in the cities, you got night soil, knee deep, you got rats running around, people throwing garbage at you and all this stuff. If you had any kind of money, I'm talking about you, would you want to live in a place like that? Well, they didn't either, okay? So as people advanced, as they got more money, a situation occurred that still occurs to this day called white flight, okay? White flight is whenever the new middle class, the people with money, move out and they move to the outskirts of the city. So in the city is urban, right? Okay, way out of the city is rural. In the middle, we have a new thing pop up called suburbs, okay? So they move to the suburbs to escape all this nasty congestion and rat infested and poop infested mess. Okay, that's called white flight. You need to know it for the test, okay? So this is what New York's suburbs look like. Now, I don't know about you. Would you rather live here? Okay, really nice neighborhood, and nice and spacious, not too crowded, nice buildings all around, or here? Or even worse than here, okay, the dumbbell tenements, the worst place you can live in New York. So a lot of folks with money moved out to the suburbs. This is actually a beautiful colorized photo from the early 1900s of a New York neighborhood, okay? One of the suburbs there. Our next section is going to be talking about natural disasters that happened around the turn of the century, okay? So water shortage creates problems for people in fire protection, okay? So look, y'all, without plumbing, we're not going to have firefighting, okay? The old firefighters, they were not employed by the state. They were not government employees. They were actually companies that would get paid by the fire that they put out. So some fire departments would actually set fire to a building and then wait for a telegraph or a phone call, and then they would rush out, and sometimes you would actually have firefights where there's two competing fire departments and they're literally beating each other up while the building's burning to see who's going to get the money to put out the fire. And meanwhile, the whole building goes down. Well, in Chicago in 1871, we had the Great Chicago Fire. Okay, there's 300 people that died here. What happened was, excuse me, these buildings were built out of wood for the most part. They were thrown up very quickly, and somebody had knocked over a kerosene lantern, and it broke, and one house caught on fire, and then the next house, and the next house, until basically all of Chicago burned down, and we had 300 dead people. The next one is in 1906, quite a ways later, okay, another one. The San Francisco earthquake, okay, 500 people dead. Now, if you look right here, this is San Francisco. Now, y'all see all this back here? How can an earthquake cause that much smoke? Well, in the San Francisco earthquake, what happened was the ground shifted, the San Andreas Fault shifted and broke, and then any gas lines, natural gas lines that were actually in the ground in the city broke as well, and they started numerous fires, and it burned San Francisco to the ground again. Now, by far the worst by far the worst disaster that we're going to talk about here is the Galveston hurricane of 1900. It doesn't have a name, okay? Today we name storms. Back then they didn't. They just named them by where they hit, okay? So what happened was Galveston is a little island off the coast of Texas. I'm sure many of you have been there before, okay? So it's a very skinny, long island. And it's a tourist spot. That's what the majority of it is. People going to the beach, people wanting to ride the ferry and stuff like that. So in 1900, a Category 5 hurricane hit Galveston in the middle of the night with absolutely no warning, okay? Back then, we didn't have satellite radar. We did not have a forecast that says there's a hurricane that's gonna hit 2 weeks from now, that kind of stuff. It's basically, gee, it looks dark over there. Oh crap, it's a hurricane. That was their advance warning, okay? Unless you had a ship out in the Gulf of Mexico that could have beat the hurricane back and told everybody that it was coming. So this hurricane comes up and the storm surge is horrific. Galveston Island was only about 3 feet above sea level. And I think the storm surge for the Galveston hurricane was 17 feet, okay? So you imagine if like a wall of 15 feet of water would move through your town. What would be left? Basically that, okay? So it flattened everything. Now, the thing I love about the Galveston hurricane is not how horrible it was. By the way, 6,000 to 10,000 people died in the Galveston hurricane, okay? That is a lot of people to die in a hurricane. Most of them were from drowning, okay? Not from the winds, but the winds were bad too. So it splintered the entire community. Everything was destroyed. What I love about the Galveston hurricane is it shows exactly what Americans were made of back then. The government was not coming to help them. They weren't expecting any help from the government. The people of Galveston basically rounded up all the dead bodies they could, put them on a big barge, a raft, and they put them out in the Gulf of Mexico. And they just dumped the bodies overboard because they did not have enough time or resources to bury them. Unfortunately, though, the same currents that brought the hurricane to Galveston also brought a bunch of the bodies back to the beach. So that was kind of a rough situation. But immediately they start piling up the debris and the garbage, and they pile it up high. They actually raised Galveston Island by 10 feet in some areas. And then they poured sand on it from the ocean. They would go out and dredge the ocean and dump sand on top of sand on top of sand on Galveston. And they would shake it where it would settle in there. And they built their entire community back within a couple of years, better than ever, without one bit of government help. That would never happen today, because Americans today are really different as far as their work ethic goes, okay? These people worked hard and they knew no help was coming. All right, next one. This one's kind of weird and crazy, okay? Right before alcohol was made illegal by the 18th Amendment, they basically said that the government said that if you have the supplies to make the alcohol, then even after prohibition comes in and after alcohol is illegal, you could still make and sell the alcohol. So you had to have the supplies before prohibition actually was signed into law with the 18th Amendment. So what happened was this guy who's in Boston, he gets a whole bunch of molasses, okay? And molasses is a really thick, sugary type substance, okay? And he very hastily builds a big old tank. Okay, this thing is 90 feet wide and 45 feet tall or something like, no, okay, 90 feet wide by 50 foot tall, okay? This is the only existing picture of this tank. But he slapped this thing together and he fills it up with molasses so that way he can continue to make rum after Prohibition. This thing was made so horribly that it leaked the entire time that it was, an actual building. So it leaked so much that the local people would actually go up right next to it, and they would find a hole where the molasses was pouring out, and they would just scrape it up, and they would go back home and use it as sugar. And they would come back with buckets of it. Well, in 1919, it was a particularly hot summer in Boston, okay? There were 2.3 million gallons of molasses in this tank. And whenever you heat any liquid, or anything for that matter, it expands. With a crappy construction, and with all that weight expanding the tank, this thing gave up. It busted. And the rivets, those little metal buttons that held all the sheets of metal together, whenever this tank busted, the sheets ripped apart and the rivets flew. Somebody said that it sounded like a machine gun was shooting. Okay, just over and over. And one man actually died from flying rivets. So it killed 21 people as the molasses rushed out of the tank at a speed of 35 miles an hour. Most of these people died by drowning, okay? And it actually killed a horse as well. They injured 150 people. So you can imagine the tank bust and just this big wall of big, thick, gooey, sticky molasses flows all over everybody. It must be one of the worst ways to die, to get drowned in molasses. This is the aftermath, okay? So the tank used to be right here. You can see how it busted and flowed out. Okay, it actually derailed a train right here. Drowned a horse, like I said. He knocked this building down. The only thing that's left is the roof. And it took years to clean it up. They said that everywhere you went in Boston from that point on, for years, it was sticky because people were tracking this molasses spill everywhere. And even a decade later, they said that if you went to this spot, you could still, during the summer months, smell the sweet smell of molasses because they couldn't clean up every little crevice. All right, moving on, okay? Something you should all be familiar with at your age, another disaster here, okay, is the RMS Titanic. Everybody has heard of the Titanic, hopefully, okay? So this is a British passenger liner. This was the biggest ship that had ever been made in the world at the time for passengers. Now, the newspapers and the man that made it said that this Titanic was unsinkable. However, it sank on its first voyage. Okay, so it's going from Europe and it's supposed to end up in America. Okay, it's supposed to come over here. It sank in the Northern Atlantic in 1912 on its maiden voyage, that means first voyage, after colliding with an iceberg. Okay, we see an artist's rendition of that right here. Over 1,500 of the Titanic's 2,200 passengers died in the freezing waters because of lack of lifeboats. So the people that built the boat said that the lifeboats, these right here, made it look too crowded because there was too many lifeboats on the deck. So they took half the lifeboats away. And that is what caused this disaster, okay? After it breaks, after it hits the iceberg, it fills up with water and the ship cracks in half and the two halves land over a mile down in the ocean, far away from each other, okay? So, let's see, Titanic was found almost 70 years later. It's 2 miles beneath, okay, 2 miles, not 1 mile, beneath the Atlantic surface in 1985. If you ever want to watch a good movie, you have to get your parents' permission. And I think it is PG-13, but there is some nudity in it, so you have to check with them. But Titanic in 1997, as Leonardo DiCaprio is the main guy, and Kate Winslet, I think, is the female here. Anyway, so it was the most expensive movie ever made at the time at a cost of $200 million. But it was also the most profitable at $1.2 billion. So they made like 6 times their money back on this. All right, let's see, I think this is the last. Yeah. Okay. All right, so the last disaster we're going to talk about, this one shows up on the leak test a lot, okay? This is a Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Okay, I'll say that again because it's a mouthful. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, 146 people dead. and it showed the need for basically fire codes. All right, so what happened here was a horrible tragedy. They have this big building, okay? It's not quite what I would call a skyscraper. I think it was like 8 or 9 stories tall, and each floor was about the size of Churchbourne High's cafeteria, if you could imagine that, okay? Now, the top 3 floors were owned by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and it was a bunch of ladies working in these tight conditions. Now, the problem was the owner, the robber baron who owned this stuff, he was a very harsh man. And he wanted to make sure that he was getting his money's worth out of these ladies' labor. One of the problems was the bathroom, the only bathroom in the entire building was on the first floor. And there was only one of them, okay? So if a lady needed to pee, she had to walk down 9 flights of stairs, wait for the bathroom, and then get back upstairs, and it might take her 45 minutes. So the owner basically comes in and one day he says, listen, I brought buckets. This is your new bathroom, okay? Nobody leaves here. They set up a privacy curtain for the ladies to use the bucket, and you're supposed to throw it out the window, okay? Also, they said no more smoke breaks. If y'all need to smoke, y'all smoke in here, okay? So he also locked the doors. He locked the ladies in to these 3 top floors, and he would not allow them any breaks until the day was over. So they're in there, they're working away, and one lady is smoking a cigarette, and she ends up throwing the cigarette into this pile of cotton scraps that they're using to, you know, the leftovers from making the shirts. And the whole place catches on fire. And there's hundreds of ladies that are in this place. They go to the door and it's locked. They can't get out. The owner's contacted as the blaze is happening. And the ladies basically have 2 choices here. Either you burn to death or jump out the window. Now, a lot of them burned to death. But then again, a lot of them chose to jump out of the window. Okay? So what you're looking at is a picture of some policemen here, and these ladies' bodies, I know it's a blurry photograph, these ladies' bodies are just littered all around. Okay? Dozens of women jumped out to their deaths rather than be burned alive. Some of them were mothers and daughters and grandmothers, all working in the same store. So after that, they changed a lot of the fire codes. Now you can't lock people inside of a building. Okay, that's one big thing. Sanitation services do not exist until the early 1900s. Okay, that means no garbage pickup, no plumbing. We talked about that before. Remember, cars are very rare at this time. So people rode horses. And if your horse died in the middle of the street, you literally had no obligation to pick it up. You would go buy a new horse, hitch it up to your wagon, and pull it away. So you see a bunch of little children playing in this filthy water right here that's right next to a dead horse. Anyway, so to combat all this stuff that was going on in New York in the early 1900s, New York passed something called the Tenement Housing Act of 1901. Remember, tenement is an apartment building, okay? So it's the Apartment Housing Act of 1901. It was the first law to ban the construction of dark, poorly ventilated tenement buildings in an effort to improve city living conditions and safety. Okay, so one thing that this thing said is that you had to have fire escapes, okay? That's one big thing. So all these big buildings in New York, they have to have a way to get out in case of a fire. You cannot lock people in. Also, every single building, every single apartment that charges rent has to have 2 things. You have to have a window and you have to have plumbing, okay? So you can't charge for rent if you didn't do that. So, okay, so outward facing windows in every room. Open courtyards. I remember the dumbbell tenement, how it was all closed up and none of the garbage could get out. Well, now they had to build archways into these dumbbell tenements so that way when it rained, it would force the garbage out into the street where the trash collectors would get it, okay? Now, look, y'all, this is the conditions that they were dealing with at the time. Remember I talked about night soil, okay? Night soil is the stuff that you and your family would put into a bucket and throw out on the street. That's exactly what this is, okay? This is feet of night soil stacked in the streets. I mean, look, they got a guy walking back here. He had to cross that big old hill of night soil. Every once in a while, the city would come by with a plow, and they would take all the night soil and push it to the sides on the sidewalk. So it was a pretty rough place to live, okay? But it's going to get better. This is where we came from. But you know, if you go to New York City today, it's nothing like that, okay? So it's kind of getting like that in LA again because of the homeless problem. But anyway, all right, that's it for this video.